It's wonderful to see you all here. It's a great opportunity after this morning's session to perhaps focus on an area of the discussion which may not have had as much focus, and that's on navigating the uncertainties as much as seizing the opportunities and forging new partnerships. The word navigating is getting a lot of use today. It's been touched on in a number of speeches. It's a very useful word. In fact, it's so useful that the Foreign Ministry, and this is just a short advertorial, has used it, navigating a shifting world. This was the Ministry, the unclassified version of the Ministry's strategic assessment issued last Monday, the first time that we have done that. The third we've produced, the first time it's been released publicly. It aims to provide some context for New Zealanders and for New Zealand's foreign trade and development policy as we look out to 2035 by identifying important shifts on in New Zealand's global strategic context. The short version of it is that it identifies three big shifts in the international order. Shifts that we argue will fundamentally affect how New Zealand makes its way in the world. The first is a shift from rules to power, so that is where rules are more contested and there's more recourse to hard power. The second, a shift from economics to security, so that's where there's more investment in security and resilience considerations are more weighted in both policy and business decision making, and a shift from efficiency to resilience. So that's using weighting more or placing more weight on drivers like sustainability and social cohesion than on just-in-time production. So to help unpack some of that and to bring perspective from outside government, I'm joined by three distinguished panellists today. Natasha Hamilton-Hart is the director of the New Zealand Asia Institute and is a professor with the Management and International Business Department here at Auckland University's Business School. Simon Draper is the long-time executive, but not for much longer, Executive Director of the Asia New Zealand Foundation, Aotearoa's leading authority on the region, and it has been long tasked with equipping New Zealanders to thrive in Asia. And then finally, Andrew Tan. Andrew's come to visit us from Singapore. He has a storied 30-year career in the much admired Singaporean government system, ranging across a really impressive number of jurisdictions: arts, the environment, transport, defence and foreign affairs. He has also, and more recently, moved very much into the commercial world. He's been the managing director of Temasek, the Singaporean government's world-renowned investment arm. Looking at this morning's Twitter feed, looks like their net portfolio value under management $455 billion. Doing well to have as much hair as he's got. And after being at Temasek, he was the Chief Executive Officer of the Maritime and Ports Authority of Singapore. And again, the Singapore port, looking at their latest information, 9,845 arrivals in the last year, and they moved 3.35 million containers. So I think we can take it that Andrew has a long pedigree both in government and business, and I would now like to invite him to the floor to give us a perspective from Singapore on navigating uncertainties, seizing opportunities and forging new partnerships. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Chris. I once did a similar review as you have just highlighted, and I know how much thought, effort that goes into it. And of course, It's never easy, but I think it's also a good opportunity for you to sort of like chart your directions ahead for your defense review and your foreign policy review as well. But distinguished guests, ladies, gentlemen, kia ora, as well as ta jia hao. Isn't it great to be back in person for these meetings following the lockdowns, as many speakers have highlighted? To think that we could experience a pandemic of such scale that would bring everything from travel, office meetings, to supply chains to a grinding halt was almost unthinkable a few years ago. But yet it happened. And it may still happen again. It's no longer what Nassim Nicholas Taleb would term black swan events. Well, events that are highly improbable, but with a highly disruptive impact. In fact, Taleb was not suggesting that we should predict these black swan events, but that we should make ourselves more robust and resilient to them. And I think that's a theme that has resonated throughout this conference. And likewise, the focus of my remarks today is how do we navigate the uncertainties, seize the opportunities, and forge new partnerships. Let me first qualify that I'm not affiliated with any organization. I'm merely expressing my personal views from a part of the world that many of you may or may not be familiar with, which is from Southeast Asia and Singapore in particular. As many speakers have highlighted, the global economy is at a crossroads. The pandemic had a disproportionate impact on countries across the world, from human lives lost to the economic fallout from lockdowns and other restrictions, as well as across industry sectors, with travel and tourism most severely affected. And no other country than New Zealand, like Singapore, where tourism is an important sector, knows how painful this can be. The recovery remains fragile, particularly in the wake of the protracted conflict in Russia-Ukraine, the rising geopolitical tensions, as well as the broader macroeconomic uncertainties. Just as the pandemic put a spotlight on the lack of vaccines and medical equipment, as well as supply chain bottlenecks, the ongoing conflicts and tensions have cast a spotlight on food, energy, security, and commodities. The IMF is now forecasting a 3% growth for the world economy over the next few years, which is the lowest medium-term forecast for the last 30 years. Even as policymakers are grappling with the real macroeconomic demand and supply aftershocks, the other elephant in the room is climate change, the effects of which are already felt across the world, from floods, droughts, to other extreme weather patterns. These challenges are all interrelated. Without growth, jobs, and investments, no economy can sustain itself, much less deal with the seismic shifts underway. The stakes are therefore high for everyone. Can central banks rein in inflation at one of its highest levels since the 80s without killing off the nascent economic recovery? Can economies recover their mojo amidst the intensifying geostrategic rivalry between the world's largest superpowers, as well as the rise of middle powers? How do businesses decide where, what, how to invest, including where to base themselves, and not to mention source their raw materials, conduct their R&D, and sell their products in an increasingly fragmented world? And last, at a time when firm actions are required, can governments, industry, and businesses even achieve their net zero targets and slow down the rate of global warming? How will countries manage the difficult trade-offs when addressing all these challenges, which are not only complex, but intertwined? And just as important, can leaders at all levels muster the political will and galvanize their electorates to make tough but necessary decisions when jobs, employment, social security are all at stake? So these are all very tough questions which countries cannot solve on their own, particularly if you suffer from what I call the tyranny of geography, the tyranny of the lack of natural resources, and the tyranny of a lack of talent, which is what a country like Singapore faces, and I believe to some extent New Zealand also faces this. So let's look at some secular tailwinds versus headwinds. The headlines, as we all know, can sometimes be alarming, so I would encourage you to go beyond these headlines. Some say we're in a new Cold War. Others say a new Iron Curtain has descended upon us, with trade flows being restricted. The reality is that the world today is very different from the aftermath of the Second World War. And according to WTO, world trade values today have increased by almost 400 times from 1950 levels, and it's only slowed down in the recent decade. We are now more connected than ever, physically and virtually, and unraveling these intricate interlinkages and interdependencies will take time, effort, and immense resources. I've not yet found a report that gives a very conclusive assessment of whether this fragmentation has at all taken place to such a degree that it would destroy or destruct the world trade flows that we know of, I think the results are probably still mixed. And the world has indeed benefited from the liberalization of trade over the last few decades. Unfortunately, it has also widened the gap between and within countries. The heightened insecurity amongst nations arising from their perceived and/or real inability to compete amidst widening income gaps is feeding into the geopolitical arena, where we now see almost every country bring trade, foreign policy, and national security into sharper focus. We also see elements of this in ongoing strategic and some might even argue ideological competition between the US and China, as each seeks to reduce their reliance on one another in critical technologies and raw materials. It's not clear to me to what lengths each side will go, but the efforts may broaden as they unravel new interdependencies. But as we speak, markets are trying to adjust to the new normal, if they can adjust at all. Businesses are already hedging themselves by reducing their concentration risk and/or seeking to diversify their supply chains to other parts of the world, be it reshoring, nearshoring, or friendshoring. I think neither of these terms adequately explain the current situation, but nonetheless, these are all the terms that have been floated around. And the latest terminology is not decoupling, nor de-risking, but diversity of supply. All eyes on Asia, which lies at the epicenter of these developments, not only because two of the largest emerging economies, China and India, are there, but because the region, including Southeast Asia, remains one of the most dynamic regions in the world. And this is what makes it all exciting for us. One of my fun jobs when I was in Temasek was scenario planning, which took us from the realm of probability to the realm of plausibility. I know Raymond is looking at me because economists prefer probability to plausibility. But we decided that as an investment firm, we would try something on top of probabilities, which is plausibilities, but not so impossible that it will be impossible. So we looked at all the secular global trends and asked ourselves broadly, how would the future of live, work, and play pan out? Where would be the interesting areas to invest in, and how can we play in those parts that are truly transformative? Now, while the responses to these questions may vary across sectors, industries, and geographies, most of us, I think, will agree on some common elements. Let me highlight 4. One is the wholesale transformation of many industries with the onset of automation, robotics, MI, AI, big data, sensors, and so on. And for example, and this morning we talked about it, we've seen how the automobile industry has been disrupted by electric vehicles, with many countries now having a time frame to eventually phase out the internal combustion engines. I think China is leading the pack at this point in time. 2, greater economic empowerment through the digital economy, especially in emerging markets. Mobile technology alongside applications that you can download, giving you access to a wide variety of services, from taxi rides, online purchases, food delivery, digital banking to insurance. Beyond simply e-commerce, digitalization has been a boon, especially for many smallholders or micro businesses in Southeast Asia, as they leverage on the latest array of technologies, from blockchain to sensors and so on, to manage their operations more efficiently and effectively. For example, in India, a wide array of apps allow farmers to better manage their crop yields, irrigation, check market prices, and sell their produce. 3, our living environment also changed dramatically. The future of our built environment will be driven by cleaner forms of energy, more intelligent systems that manage everything from traffic to lighting, and the use of greener construction materials. Likewise, making cities more climate resilient. There are a few countries or cities that can really attempt these at scale. Singapore is one of them. In China, the opportunity is even greater, as you heard from the earlier presentation. Many cities are already well ahead in this space, having the benefit of both of greenfield sites to experiment with. And 4, can we envisage a world where we can create digital twins of almost anything? In Singapore, we are working on a digital twin of our next generation megaport in Tuas, which currently handles about 40 over million TEUs a year, but eventually we will be able to ramp that up to 65 million TEUs in its steady state. 65 million TEUs. I'm not sure what the port of Auckland or Wellington handles, but this is huge, immense scale, for which then you really have to look at how you automate this port and optimize its operations. Now, all these trends are converging in Asia for several reasons. First, Asia is growing. You've heard Raymond's presentation with the likes of China at, I'm not sure what it will be, 5-7%, India at 7%, Malaysia, Indonesia at 4-5%, Vietnam at 6-7%, alongside a rising middle class driving consumption as seen in the uptake of e-commerce. And the IMF expects Asia and the Pacific to contribute about 70% of global growth this year alone. And this growth is attracting investors from all over. Second, rapid urbanization. When I set up the Center for Livable Cities in Singapore in 2008, less than half the world was urbanized. Today, more than half the world's population lives in cities, which is projected to increase to 2/3 in 2050. And many of these large urban concentrations will be in Asia. Feeding, housing, powering, and moving the people in these cities will be immense. Third, growing connectivity in the region, arising from the new physical and digital infrastructure investments in the region, with investments coming from China, India, Japan, Korea, including Singapore, alongside international financial organizations and large infrastructure PE funds. I recall when I was in New Delhi for a UN Habitat Summit in 2008 or 9, and I listened to a speech by the former and late Indian Minister for Urban Development, Jaipur Reddy. Some of you may know him, where he said, the moment anyone in India has reached a certain station in life, they want to own a nice car. This was one reason why Tata's experiment with the Nano, arguably the cheapest car in the world with all good intentions, did not take off. It was simply perceived as a low-end car and did not meet the aspirations of that generation. And Reddy's remarks reflect not just the aspirations of the Indian middle class, but middle classes throughout all Asia. I was just in Ho Chi Minh City last month, and similar aspirations were voiced by the many young Vietnamese I spoke to. They want a well-paying job that will allow them to buy a nice home, car, or motorbike, and holiday overseas. I happen to sit on the newly formed board of Agoda, an online travel platform, or OTA as it's known in the industry, that is a subsidiary of Booking Holdings, one of the world's largest online travel platforms. The rebound in leisure travel starting last year has brought in higher revenues than pre-COVID for the group, that is Booking Holdings. So the rise of Asia's middle class driving new consumption patterns is also reflected in the trade data. According to ADB, intra-regional trade made up close to 60% of Asia and the Pacific's total trade in 2020, the highest since 1990. This explains why all the global shipping lines I know are expanding their services in the region, including riding on the e-commerce wave by integrating their services with inland logistics as well as warehousing acquisitions. You name them, Maersk, CMA CGM, MSC, Costco, PSA, they're all doing this. No longer will they be known as shipping companies. They'll be known as logistics solutions companies by the end of this decade. And finally, we can expect the digital economy to grow even larger, albeit with more realistic valuations for the many technology companies in the region. Based on the latest Bain, Google, and Temasek New E-Economy report 2022, Southeast Asia's digital economy covering e-commerce, transport and food, online travel, online media, and financial services is expected to exceed US $300 billion in gross merchandise value, GMV, by 2025 and reach US $1 trillion by 2030. Of course, there are still many short to medium-term challenges in the region to overcome. Raymond is an expert. You can ask him after over at lunch. Monetary and fiscal policies are likely to remain tight as regional governments seek to keep inflation and public debt in check. And several countries either just had or will be heading into elections amidst a new generation of voters who desire change. And the region has to navigate, of course, the increasingly complex relationship between the major powers. So, you ask me, what are the implications for businesses as you plan your go-to-market strategy? Well, first, I think rapid urbanization in the region has opened up new opportunities, no longer confined to, as some of the speakers mentioned, first-tier cities, but now the second and third-tier cities. China especially, India, and including Southeast Asia, you will find the same phenomenon taking place. You will find new addressable markets that require the basics: food, energy, water, essential services as healthcare, housing, and education. Next, anyone traveling the region in the last few years will immediately note how much easier it is to get from point A to point B. New roads, bridges, harbors, public transit systems are being built. New industrial and economic zones are being set up, and all this infrastructure will need to be maintained, operated, and upgraded. Second, the scale of digitalization will widen and deepen, and here is where the physical connectivity meets the digital. In e-commerce, marketplaces like Shopee, Lazada, Tokopedia already take up the lion's share of regional e-commerce, but we will see moves from B to C to B to B to C that will connect regional suppliers with small to medium-sized businesses that will allow communities in outlying areas access to a wider array of goods and services. We see startups across the region seeking to integrate supply and demand services for micro-businesses, likewise integration of last-mile delivery in logistics. Meanwhile, existing super apps like Gojek and Grab in Southeast Asia for food delivery and ride-hailing are under pressure to be profitable, even as they branch out into adjacent sectors as digital banking, online purchases, and even telemedicine. Third, on the sustainability front, many, if not all, the countries in the region are also seeking to decarbonize their industries, including hard-to-abate sectors as air and sea transport, steel, cement, and petrochemicals, especially given the nature of their economies. Southeast Asia also hosts much of the world's nature-based solutions like carbon sinks, alongside opportunities for tech-based solutions looking for deployment, for example, carbon capture and storage. And countries like Indonesia also possess rich mineral resources such as nickel for production of EVs. Fourth, while still important, public markets are now giving way to private markets in financing assets and growth of new businesses, and equally interestingly, a greater willingness by private equity firms to deploy long-term or patient capital in emerging sectors as climate tech, energy transition, and impact investments, and that's something which I will also encourage you to look at. Fifth, investors are also looking for alternative production bases as part of their overall hedging strategy, particularly in manufacturing. Countries as Vietnam and India have already benefited from some of this shift. In the case of Vietnam, even as it benefits from being an alternative manufacturing base to, say, for example, China, the interlinkages between China and Vietnam are in fact strengthening the relationship because much of the intermediate inputs from China now forms a key part of Vietnam's exports. So even as we speak of reducing existing interdependencies, new ones are arising, not just in Vietnam, but across other parts of the region. So it's actually a more nuanced picture that you will get if you zoom in into the specific products and specific services. So, for example, the digital community in the region in areas as software programming and development has also changed and now spans across several countries, from Singapore, Vietnam, to Indonesia, alongside China and India. So it also compels a country like Singapore to rethink its role in the regional digital ecosystem. Besides putting digital first in all we do, can we also champion digital governance, particularly with the onset of AI? Can we also champion interoperability of payment systems across the region? And likewise, can we promote cybersecurity solutions? So how New Zealand, Singapore, and our major trading partners can work together? Ladies and gentlemen, Asia is at the cusp of profound transformation amidst growing uncertainty. You have to be in the region to experience this newfound optimism and confidence, notwithstanding the current uncertainties. However, the region's growth hinges on peace and stability, which it has enjoyed for the last few decades. The peaceful rise of China, or both China and India, will be key, just as their relations to the rest of the world, who have no wish to frame everything through the lens of US-China competition. And that explains why, if you are standing in Southeast Asia, the view that we take is a very nuanced position vis-a-vis where you see some of these other views across other parts of the world. Indeed, the growing interdependence amongst regional economies as manifest by ASEAN's renewed vigor in promoting regional integration, because ASEAN wants to stay in the driver's seat and drive that, and I think there are some countries who respect that, and that's very much welcome. So that also shapes the outlook for the region towards the ongoing superpower conflict and explains why many have avoided being drawn into choosing sides or seeking binary outcomes. The view from Southeast Asia reflects the hopes and aspirations of a younger generation with less of a historical baggage, who sense new opportunities like never before and therefore wish to avoid any conflict, whether over South China Sea, Taiwan, or Korean Peninsula. I think as small countries with close ties with all the major protagonists, New Zealand and Singapore can be the bridge to better understanding and cooperation amongst all the major powers. What we lack in size, we can make up in terms of our ability to create new opportunities and spaces for all parties to work peacefully together. To the extent that we can foster constructive engagement and healthy competition, we should encourage this. It will require active diplomacy, identifying new areas of cooperation, and fostering win-win partnerships. And in doing so, we should, as your Prime Minister says, continue to uphold a rules-based international regime alongside an open and inclusive environment where everyone feels that they have a stake. And all these multilateral free trade agreements, I won't go through all the acronyms, recap, CTPP, and your EU, New Zealand FTA will all help prevent the world from fragmenting into protectionist trading blocs. New Zealand and Singapore can bring unique perspectives and thought leadership to bear on key issues from defense, security, economics, trade, to climate change. And also in this regard, I'm glad that arising from Secretary Yellen's recent trip, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry will also be visiting China to begin restarting, I chose my words carefully, to begin restarting talks on climate change. Every bit to rebuild trust and find common ground will be key. Achieving greater resilience and security in supply chains, energy security, and critical technologies, all of which are highly important by themselves, no doubt, cannot be done alone, but only through stronger cooperation. Likewise, in new areas such as green financing, artificial intelligence, and digitalization, all this require effective public-private partnerships and international cooperations. And finally, both countries can also invest in building up intangible goodwill, starting with more people-to-people trade exchanges, cross-sharing expertise across our business associations, education, and research institutions. And of course, Singapore welcomes more New Zealand businesses to use us as a springboard to a region, as a global hub and gateway to Asia. This is the best time to step up your presence. I'm going to jump to the conclusion here to allow time for discussion. Keeping options open for future generations is key. We can't anticipate what the future will be, but we certainly should not foreclose pathways to future cooperation. I'm reminded of the forward-thinking statements of our two prime ministers last year by the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, who said the geopolitical uncertainties, supply chain vulnerabilities, and rising protectionism make it all the more important for countries to work together to find a path forward, identify win-win opportunities. In this endeavor, Singapore and New Zealand are natural partners. And this was echoed by your former Prime Minister and again mentioned by your Prime Minister this morning. And if we go back in history, New Zealand and Singapore have traditionally enjoyed close ties dating back to the early days of our independence, thanks to the strong rapport between our leaders and similar security outlook towards the region. I recall our former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's exchange with Norman Kirk, New Zealand's Labour Prime Minister in the 70s, as he sat one evening in Singapore on the lawn of Sri Temasek, where Prime Minister Lee asked how New Zealand saw the prospects for stability and growth for Singapore, where I quote, Kirk's reply was direct and pithy. New Zealand was the odd man out, while Singapore was the odd man in the region. But Lee believed both New Zealand and, for that matter, Australia's destinies lay in closer ties with Asia, a message he consistently conveyed to both sides. He was not wrong. Today, we see this imperative borne out by events. We are neither in or out, but very much an integrated part of a diverse and complex ecosystem. That's the reality we face. Mr. Lee concluded his chapter on New Zealand in his memoirs, which I had the privilege to work on with him, with one line, just one line. In my experience, the New Zealanders can be depended on to honor their undertakings. I repeat that again. In my experience, the New Zealanders can be depended on to honor their undertakings. I'm glad that your Prime Minister this morning mentioned that you will conduct your approach, engagement with the rest of the world consistently, predictably, as well as respectfully. And this could well be your biggest intangible asset. Singapore has certainly experienced this firsthand after our independence through your support. So as we navigate the challenging times ahead, let's think in terms of what's possible rather than what's impossible, and of course, nothing can be impossible. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for quite a survey and also the positive message which you left. Now, someone who's had to think a lot about how or two people have had to think a lot about how we ensure New Zealand is is the right person or the right country in, not the odd one out. Natasha and Simon, and I was going to ask each of them to sort of give us a few remarks, and then we'll pick up some Q&A from the floor. Thank you, Natasha.
Well, thank you very much, Chris Seed, and thank you, Andrew Tan, for an amazingly rich and packed tour of the horizon. I want to actually make 4 points in the sense that go into the critical issues and drivers that you put on the table about this geopolitical moment in which the rise of US-China conflict is threatening to unravel the complex interdependence, interlinked supply chains, and the architecture of trade and investment that has underpinned growth and dynamism in the broad Asian region for the last 30 years. And the 4 points that I wanted to say were basically, one is that the East Asian order is changing. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the rules-based trade and business environment internationally, but under the rules and the norms, there is a power structure and a security architecture. And East Asia's emergence as a dynamic and growing region has been underpinned until recently by really the uncontested primacy of the US. It was a hierarchical regional order, and one country clearly predominated in the security realm. Now that is over. It's over because China is now a great power. It is a superpower in its own right. And it is over because the US decline in capacity and willingness to play that role is clearly evident to us all. So we are seeing a multipolar and very much changing and less predictable order in which US leadership cannot remain as it was. The second point I want to make is that the new security logic that we have seen increasingly evident in US, but also to some extent Chinese policy in the last 5 years, since 2018, injects into the world of commerce a fundamentally different dynamic. Business is about win-win solutions. It is positive sum. It is about growing the pie. Even if you are rivals, you can grow the pie and mutually benefit, and you pursue business with the idea that you and your partners will gain from it. The security logic is completely different. In the security realm, the relationship is zero-sum. You win, that means I lose. And that is the attitude that we see quite openly articulated, not just in US speeches at the highest level, but in their actions that they have undertaken, targeting particular firms clearly with an aim to reduce their reliance and dependence on the Chinese economy, but also, as seems to me quite obvious, to try and prevent, or at least slow down the emergence of China at the cutting edge of new technologies that will be both economically and strategically important. So this new logic is very unwelcome to anyone in business, I imagine, unless you're an arms supplier perhaps, because it is inefficient. It removes the scope for win-win gains, and once you bring that mentality into the business sphere, all bets are off. The third point is that the supply chain restructuring that we're seeing is, of course, much more nuanced, as Andrew Tan said. It is not a rush out of China. In fact, a lot of the dependencies that we are now seeing between China and the rest of the region are in fact deepening. But this is only at the pleasure, really, of both the Chinese and the US governments. Because if either party were to accelerate and deepen its restrictions on third-party engagement with the other side in terms of efforts to cut off critical technology, to friendshore, to bring things back home, this will make it increasingly difficult for economies to maintain deep and dense connections with both the US side of the Pacific and the Sino-centric regional economy. And the fourth point I want to make is that Andrew Tan said the importance, we must pay attention to the importance of keeping our options open. Now, every country in East Asia, as far as I'm aware, just about, has said we do not want to choose. This was articulated by the Singapore Foreign Minister recently on his visit to the US. Don't make us choose. We want to be able to act independently and to maintain relationships with everyone. On the other hand, in the current environment, every choice you make is effectively taking you one step one way or the other. It is not that you make each decision, at each decision point, the game resets to zero. Each decision point that you make, each decision that you take, each trading relationship that you build, closes doors behind you. So there is a certain path dependence and lock-in effect in which the business ties, the investments, the flows of people and technology and e-commerce platforms and infrastructure that you build and the constituencies that you therefore create in your own domestic political economies, these create the groundwork for the next choice that you will make. And in the case of East Asian countries, it seems to me that in the economic realm, the choices are pushing towards an increasingly Sino-centric regional economy, and that is now increasingly at odds with the security dynamic that is playing out. So sorry to be the person with the pessimistic note, but I see this as an arena in which there is a lot of scope for tension that will need to be quite carefully managed.
On the theme of sober.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to add onto one of the things Natasha's said, and it's been a theme today about uncertainty. So one of my reckons is that we haven't entered a period of uncertainty. Rather, we've exited a remarkable period of certainty that in the course of human history, 1945 to 2015, was unique with having this rules-based order. And that what we've got now, what that means is that what we've got now is going to continue. This is not muddling through for 3, 4, 5 years until the old order we knew comes back. This is the new normal. Someone said to me, we are swimming in a pool of black swans, I think, at the moment. But you don't want my reckons. I thought what I'd do is tell you what New Zealanders think. So one of the things Asia New Zealand Foundation has is a 26-year survey that asks New Zealanders, what do you think about Asia? Now, and this is contestable, I know, but on the idea that members of parliament, follow what the public mood is, what it means for business is what the public are saying will filter its way through into our body politic, and already has. The trend line about how New Zealanders see Asia generally is positive. It continues to be positive. What we know is that the more New Zealanders know about Asia, the more they want to know about Asia. That's a really important data point, and it builds confidence. So what does that mean? The number one travel destination for young New Zealanders is Asia. That's where they most want to go. Now, this is the China Business Summit, so some of the China data. 30% of New Zealanders see China as a friend. 37% see it as a threat, right? So these are very similar numbers that you see in like the Lowy poll in Canada. The difference between, say, the Australian one and our one is those numbers are the same, but New Zealanders say, we need to know more about China. We don't understand it enough. We need to lean into this relationship. Whereas the Australian response is generally, we need to diversify. So there's a few differences there between the headline numbers. A couple of the other things that are coming through, and then I'll finish, conscious of time. Really strong demographic changes in New Zealand, and I don't think we've really talked about that too much here, but the young people in New Zealand are learning about China and learning about Asia in very different ways than old people like me did. We've heard about digital. Digital is the way that young New Zealanders are learning about China and learning about Asia. We had expected to see more out of the perceptions of Asia, more about India and more about some of the other countries, but we didn't see that. So China still remains, when you ask New Zealanders what they think about Asia, they talk about China. So, Asia's a very big country, but it really, China is the country that dominates New Zealanders' thinking. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Simon. We've managed to almost run the clock down, but I just wanted to take one opportunity to, because it's a sort of an issue that we've all been creeping towards, but to actually ask Andrew if he could just give us a view, a boardroom view, if you like, about, and the question was asked earlier about how New Zealand companies are thinking about geopolitical challenges and how they're factoring that into their decision making. In the week after our Prime Minister was in China, publicly, there was quite a number of challenges to the opportunity piece. We saw 11 aircraft cross the median line in the Taiwan Strait. We saw the Chinese Parliament confirm new legislation which redefined espionage and which has a lot of the business communities, international business communities have worried about that. And we saw of course, the Hong Kong police issue their warrants and bounties on the heads of 8 pro-democracy. So how are those realities factored in around board tables in Singapore? 2 minutes.
Well, these are very challenging questions, no doubt. And I would say that without speculating into all those moves that you've highlighted, Chris, I would say that certainly there is now a greater acute awareness of what the world is heading into, this geopolitical uncertainty, and that's certainly factoring in at least all the board discussions that I've had. And it really depends on which sectors you're operating in. Here is where I say you really have to look at it from a specific sector point of view. So if you're if you are exposed to critical technologies, for example, which I don't think New Zealand is exposed to as, say, Singapore, for example, because we have advanced manufacturing facilities, semiconductors, and so on, and they will have to be more conscious of the fact that this comes under stricter export controls, and we just have to live with that. It doesn't mean that the show is over. It just means that you just have to find a way to address that, and also to engage the regulators in terms of then making sure that they do not put in place a blanket ban, and that's going to be part of a long conversation that you would find in not just in Singapore but in other parts of the region as well. But if you are not looking at semiconductors, for example, there's no reason why the other sectors should get squeamish about these developments, because as previous speakers have highlighted, China remains open for business, just as New Zealand and the rest of the world. And I don't think we can decouple, if I can use it in this context, trade, security, foreign affairs so easily, because everything is intertwined. So, but at the end of the day, all politics is domestic. So you can't feed your people, you can't house your people, you can't give them good jobs, then I think you can forget about the rest, right? So I think economic growth right now is also a big imperative for every country. So that's going to take on a greater priority. And I don't see why growth cannot be inconsistent with security, with diplomacy. I think all of them should fall into a very constructive troika, if I would say. Yes, people are more concerned about supply chain risks, but they're looking at that anyway. Many companies factor that in their boardroom discussion. So this is just one added factor that you have to take in your discussions, right? And then secondly, everyone wants access to the markets around the world. And if these markets are open, I don't see why we shouldn't be investing in there. And thirdly, there has to be level playing field. So, which is why, as many speakers have highlighted, we still need to have the existing regime, so to speak, in terms of open, inclusive, rules-based trading system. This is not to say that there are not areas that need to be fixed, and I think the trade ministers are conscious about upgrading many of these arrangements alongside with recognizing that the world has changed and the weight has shifted to Asia, and I think many countries in Asia feel that their voice should have that expression in many of these institutions that were set up after Bretton Woods.
So clearly that idea, navigation is possible, and I guess the theme that we are indeed all in this waka together, e waka e noa. So thanks. I'd just like to thank Andrew very much for his reflections. I'd like to thank Natasha and Simon for their commentary, and look forward to the next session. Thank you very much.